Thank you, Ilaria. Now we have Richard Webb from Nature, London. He is the chief magazine editor.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak and for all the previous contributions. I'm worried that at this stage on a Saturday morning there might be a lack of new, true and beautiful things to say that haven't already been said, but here goes. So science communication, it's a subject that's come up a lot in previous contributions. I come at this from the point of view of a practitioner, specifically as someone involved in the communication of results from the scientific literature to interested end users, both the general public and other stakeholders. My background is as a scientist myself. Like George, in fact, I'm another physicist in the room, a particle physicist originally in my case. 20 years ago, in fact, I was doing a brief postdoc up the road at the Institute, the International Institute of Nuclear Physics in Trieste. It's lovely to be back in this area. And now I'm a science communicator, which I would describe as a bespoke, somewhat sheltered, often inconsequential industry that suddenly found itself hugely exposed during COVID-19. We were very used to preaching to the converted, talking to people who shared the same language and shared the same ways of thinking. The role of journalism, at least in its idealized sense, is to call the powerful to account. Suddenly, during the pandemic, scientists had a lot of power, if unwanted and if indirectly, but they were had become prime actors in democratic societies, with their activities subject to intense scrutiny. And I don't think it's something that many of them, or indeed us, as communicators of science, were particularly prepared for. My button is not working, there we go. But first, to talk about a little more about who I am, but more importantly, who I'm speaking for. Nature today is probably most familiar as the most highly cited, multidisciplinary scientific journal in the world. But right from the get-go, it has had a dual purpose, as shown by our mission statement, a close variant of which was published in our very first issue back in 1869. That dual mission is first to serve scientists through the prompt publication of advances in any branch of science, but second, to provide a forum for reporting and discussion of news about science and to ensure that those results are rapidly disseminated to the public in a fashion that conveys their significance for knowledge, culture, and daily life. So science in its context, and that's also an inherently political context, as we saw within COVID-19. So we employ about 60 reporters and editors in various locations across the world and operate independently of the journal's research publishing side. I head up that operation. And we aim to act as a trusted source of information from research analysed and interpreted for other researchers, other journalists, policymakers, and the general public. We are in the lucky position, given that we are funded by the subscription monies from scientists and scientific institutions, that our output is maintained free for everyone for a certain time after publication as a public good. And some of our most significant constituents are actually other media outlets worldwide who might lack their own specialist science reporting. So you might well have read our COVID-19 reporting or derivatives of it without actually knowing it, just to try and circumscribe the role of the organisation that I head up. So what did we do during COVID-19? We doubled down on our remit as an honest conduit for trusted information from the research coalface for policymakers, communicators and the general public, pivoting early in the year as it became clear that something was was going on, to full COVID coverage, all our resources devoted to COVID. We later pulled back to half of our coverage of COVID, with an emphasis on communicating primary research and the views of researchers on what was going on, aiming to add depth and authority in hotly contested areas and giving a global data-driven focus to coverage. That's just a selection of some of our output. I found it wonderful going down memory lane to see January 2020 when we were talking about a novel coronavirus. We didn't even have vocabulary to discuss what we were discussing. But this was a huge challenge, as I've said, and the reasons may, to a large extent, be obvious. There was huge uncertainty, certainly initially, high stakes that we weren't used to dealing with, a hugely fast pace of development with a vast quantity of new information, not all of the same quality, competition from misinformation growing. I'll come on to talk a little more about that. And there was a hugely expanded audience for news from the research coalface. Not all of that audience as well versed in science as they might have been, as we might have been used to. On the right, you'll see a graph of our readership. The blue line is 2019. The red line, the red line 2020. In those first phases, in February to April 2020, we were seeing maybe 4 times as many people reading our output. And the biggest challenge was, of course, that science became politics, and politics became science-driven. And there are very few people qualified to speak both languages, and I would count journalists among them. The UK Science Media Centre, which is a collective that exists to improve the flow of trusted information to the wider media and public in the UK, we got together and did a very useful report. And this, I found this quote, bottom right, particularly telling, that specialist science journalists in broadsheet newspapers and in daily newspapers in this case spent as much time telling their news desks what not to cover as they did reporting the science that they assessed to be worth reporting. And that's worth considering as we think about the communication ecosystem, that news desks in traditional newspapers, at least, and I'll get on to the non-traditional media a bit later on, tend to be governed by people immersed in the world of politics and political reporting. They're used to a fast flow of information and rapid changes in the basis of facts. Insofar, they were perhaps well set up for the information flow in the early stages of the pandemic, but they're also interested or comfortable with publishing gossip and unattributed briefings to generalize sweepingly about new developments. Science experts had a hard time reining them in. As I say, we exist in an ecosystem as science communicators close to the research community, and the challenges we faced existed in symbiosis with challenges faced by a scientific community where science had become politics and politics had become science. The demand for concrete facts very fast led science to loosen its guardrails. On the right, scarcely visible, I'm afraid you'll see 2 graphs from an analysis of science publishing that we did at the end of 2020. You'll see the huge rise in the left of the 2 figures of coronavirus related publications. By November 2020, over 160,000 preprints and papers mentioning coronavirus. On the right-hand graph, you will see a graph of peer review times in medical journals. The key thing here is on the extreme right, the lowest line, that is coronavirus-related papers. The time for peer review dropped precipitously between January and February to near zero, not zero, single-digit days. That's a tribute to the dedication of the scientific community in wanting to get facts of huge public relevance out in a situation of a magnitude not seen before in their working lives, but it's not difficult to imagine in that situation that details of normal quality control, how that might have suffered under those circumstances. The science of SARS-CoV-2, in other words, in early 2020, certainly was messy, uncertain, and present in overwhelming quantity. And that hit head-on that political desire for clean narratives, that public demand for certainty, as George and others have put it. And often in those early days, those who shouted the loudest were heard the loudest, as those who maybe remember some of the early debates about, for example, the modes of transmission of SARS-CoV-2, how the difficulty in establishing what the truth was, there will recall. The final point I would make about the challenge of science, of the pandemic to science, is one that only emerged slightly later on as a factor in shifting attitudes towards the science. As draconian measures such as lockdowns were announced by politicians, often with scientific advisors by their sides, science and scientists ceased to be seen as neutral, apolitical actors by some. And this is just merely to summarize what I've said and put it in the context of the title of the talk of uncertain truths and certain untruths. Certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, answers to key questions of huge interest. How contagious is this disease? How does it spread? How deadly is it? And to whom? How might it be contained or treated? What unknown or highly uncertain? And subject to frequent reinterpretation. The science that purported to explain that was itself of varying quality and in need of careful objective interpretation, and sifting the wheat from the chaff was a huge and very responsible undertaking. At the same time, the boundary between scientific messaging and political messaging was increasingly blurred, certainly to the general public. And in this incredibly noisy situation, I'd just like to point out that misinformation naturally becomes a signal, where you have a situation of armchair epidemiologists. Everyone wants to know the answers. Rumor abounds, even without bad actors. Misinformation becomes the signal. There's a lovely phrase that's existed for over 2 centuries in various forms. A lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. That was the situation we were working under, certainly in our community. So looking forward to the next pandemic, the good and the bad of COVID-19. What's good, actually, that we learn from our experience of COVID-19? Well, certainly I and many other people in both old and newer media are aware of a broader public interest in science. Many people are more clued up about the basis of viruses and transmissions. Before COVID, who outside of epidemiology had ever heard of anyone conversing about R numbers before, for example, down the pub, in those times when we were allowed to be down the pub? What's bad? Well, the flip side of that great interest is, of course, pandemic fatigue. There are many people who lived through COVID-19 and want to forget about it. And that is of course, not inconsequential. And when we talk about, as many have been, about trying to gain public support for measures in support of pandemic preparedness, it's certainly something we're going to have to deal with in any communication response during the next pandemic, coupled with the political polarization of trust in science. And there I mentioned for the first time that crucial word, trust. Now, I don't want to overstate this, and I think Thomas yesterday mentioned the top line of this, and I've got a graph there from the Pew Research Center, specifically about the confidence in science in the US. And what I want to point out in that is that trust in science has not massively decreased as a result of the pandemic. And it is massively higher than for almost any other group in society, certainly higher than for journalists. But what is true is that that trust in science has polarized. It has become political. And that is something that we are going to have to deal with in any communication response. That is not going to go away. I think that is an enduring legacy of COVID-19, although there are signs of some slight swing back. But the other thing is, of course, the misinformation fire hose has only got more powerful in the intervening time. We now have AI. That is increasingly a factor in the scientific literature, in the pollution of the scientific literature. How we are going to cope with that in the next pandemic, I think, is an issue that is not, we haven't given sufficient thought to. A little bit about how news outlets can respond, and this is in the sense of trying to find, I mean, I'm conscious of coming with problems, not solutions. I think one thing that is clear that the pandemic taught us is that the importance of specialist science and health reporters who can interrogate scientists and the scientific literature is more essential than ever. And I say that without prejudice to the reality, because for all the increased interest in science, because of the wider shifts in the industry, daily newspapers in particular are shedding specialist reporters like viral particles. It's indeed a microcosm of the wider thing we've been talking about. Support for global public health is being cut just at the time it is needed most. Support for this kind of journalism is being cut just at the time we need it most. Another further and related points are that with social media atomizing outlets, and I include my own among these, need to be across platforms and media in the way they have never been before. Nature, an august institution born in 1869, will soon be on TikTok for the first time. That's a necessary response to a media landscape where especially young people are not consuming news as words on a page or even words on a website, but in the form of short video, short audio, podcasts while doing something else. It's also not enough to report facts anymore, not just to say what is right, and I think other speakers have touched on this. Misinformation must be actively debunked, and a part of resources of reputable news organisations must be devoted to this. My own organisation has started to do this. You'll see some on the right, some output of ours reacting to Trump's announcement about links between autism and Tylenol against across media, across printed page, audio, video. We took the argument, laid out the facts. That is increasingly necessary. So what does good journalism do where science becomes politics? Just to finish up, COVID-19 was a point where science reporting became inherently political. That's led to some reflection on how we do scientific reporting. I do think, too, that there were instances in the pandemic where, despite prizing ourselves on being objective and following the facts, we, and I'm talking about the science communication establishment more generally, not just Nature, failed to be sufficiently open to new facts and got lost in narratives of our own making. I would highlight, for example, being slow to move beyond the narrative of draconian lockdowns being absolutely necessary for public safety and exploring other options. And as political concern about the economic and social fallout of lockdowns increased, the science establishment, for want of a better word, became overly associated with one side of that argument. And that is a factor in the polarization of attitudes towards science. I don't think we're unguilty in that. These are a few things that we have drawn out as an institution of how to do this. We should not assume that our audience shares our political priors. Ilaria mentioned the agricultural chemist. Even people versed in science will have very diverse political views about science and objectivity. We must seek to be neutral in tone at all time, challenge as a critical friend. Don't assume that scientists are always asking the right questions, and question them about their priors. Don't ignore broader political and social contexts. Bring in expertise from economics, from the wider public health community, from social science. Avoid false certainty. Express uncertainty. But admitting what we don't know is important to saying what we don't know. We had falsely certain narratives, I think, in parts of the pandemic. And remain open to legitimate contrarian voices. That's got to be used carefully, but allow debates to play out in the open rather than pre-selecting our narratives. Last slide, I'm over time. Some other things that the wider ecosystem could do. We need more support for outreach. We can't do this on our own. There's a whole ecosystem that needs support here. We need to think about how we communicate scientific data separately from government communication. And crucially, I think, we talk about misinformation, but we need education to combat this. We need education in critical thinking. It can't be just about telling people what to think. We need to give people the tools to be receptive, to sift out good information from the bad. That's a crucial part of any effective communication response to a future pandemic. And with that, I thank you.